He heard his name as if someone had torn the roof off the world. Audie Murphy, the bravest soldier in Europe. The hall blurred, champagne fizzed like distant artillery. For a breath, Audie felt the floor drop away, and he imagined every face around him as a photograph, frozen, glaring, expecting. A dozen cameras shuddered. Men in polished uniforms tipped their hats like a tide. Somewhere, a band played as if to drown out the noise in his head. Audie clutched at the rough fabric of his jacket and tasted metal, not from the glass at his lips, but from a ledger of boys whose names he had promised to carry. He could hear Private Cole's laugh in his left ear, the hollow sound that now lived inside him. He could feel the weight of medals he had never asked for, their cold thumbs against his heart. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Patton's voice cracked like a pistol again, triumphant and obscene, and the applause took on a life of its own. Audie wanted to step back into the shadow where the world made more sense. Barn hay, a woman's hand that taught him how to sew a button. Nights so dark you could forget the weight of all the dead. Instead, the light found him. Cameras found him. Reporters began to orbit like wasps. A young lieutenant mouthed instructions he couldn't hear. Men in brass leaned in, calculating. Patton, beaming, with a swagger that carved the room in two, lifted his glass higher, as if his praise could hoist a boy into some iron sky. She saw him before he saw her. Claire Laurent stood by a bank of folding chairs, a thermos gripped in one hand, a stain of iodine on her sleeve. And when Patton declared Audie the bravest soldier in Europe, the nurse's jaw tightened as if against a sudden wind. She had seen brave before, bravery that smelled of wet bandages and the copper tang of blood, so she watched for the aftershock, the tightening in a man's hands, the way his shoulders folded away from praise like a bird's wing. She had been repairing towns and bodies for months, stitching flesh and inventorying grief, and she had learned to read the small betrayals bravery can make against the soul. Audie carried more betrayals than most. He was 21, and everything about him still hinted at the fields he'd left. Hands that could mend a fence or clip a splinter without thinking. A face that hardened in sunlight and softened when no officer could see. He had been a boy with a Winchester once, then a rifleman, then a single line in telegrams to relatives who were told he had done something that made medals necessary. In the aftermath, he had learned to keep a ledger, not of honors, but of the debts owed to friends who never came home. That ledger was private. Patton's toast smashed it into glass and sent it scattering across a room full of strangers. Patton saw in Audie what generals see when they want a standard-bearer. Clarity reduced to symbol, a human banner to rally weary men and press a narrative into the press. His praise came wrapped in convenience, protection for units that needed morale, a living talisman to keep enlistment letters fat. Audie, small as he felt, heard an offer under the glink: rank, safe quarters, a platform from which he could push back on the bureaucrats who clipped supplies to Claire's field hospitals. The temptation sat in his stomach like bread and poison mixed together. If he wore the label of bravest, perhaps Patton could keep the soldiers coming to Claire's wards from being siphoned off into another far-off operation. Perhaps Claire's supplies would arrive on time. Perhaps, absurdly, the world would stop recognizing him as a ledger of debts and start recognizing him as a man who could demand things. Claire's voice, when it found him later that night under a slant of moon outside the military hospital, was gentle but blunt. "Don't let them make you into a poster, Audie." Her accent was traceable to Bordeaux and broken by American resolve. Her hands smelled of soap and the faint iron of blood. He wanted, at that moment, to show her the ledger, to peel back every fold of it and let her read the names written there in his secret script. Instead, he laughed too quickly and said, "I don't much like posters." She watched him, reading the line around his mouth like sutures that might split. "You flinch when the band plays," she said. "You don't look soldiers in the eye when they cheer. I've seen men like you before. They half believe what others tell them about themselves so they can sleep." The next morning, the press was waiting. A reporter thrust a microphone like a narrow sword. Cameras roared. Men in uniform moved like a well-drilled chorus. Audie kept his hands in his pockets and tried to remember how to be small, how to slip back into the life he'd chosen after bullets had rewritten his days. Claire stood by his side as he answered questions with soft, clipped details. A false laugh here, a redirection there. She was a harbor he did not deserve but needed in the small hours. And for the first time since the toast, Audie understood how precarious harbor could be if the storm outside wanted to map it for its own ends. Patton's praise had lit a bonfire. The town, the brass, the press, none of them knew how easily a bonfire burned what it warmed. The dilemma settled in Audie's chest like a new metal. Accept the shelter of a general's favor and risk becoming a slogan, or refuse it and leave Claire exposed to the caprice of commanders whose sympathy ran as shallow as parade ground mud. He dreamed that night of a field of crosses and woke with a gasp, the echo of Patton's voice folding into the hollow where Cole's laugh used to live. Dawn came thin and rumor-laden, headlines already printed like small verdicts, a wire service looping his name into every other sentence. Men he had shared foxholes with approached him with odd reverence, like worshippers at a shrine who could not quite remember the doctrine. Audie felt the reverence slide off him the way dew slides off corn. It clung only in places that would bruise. Claire arrived at the hospital before breakfast, hair tucked under a surgical cap, eyes sharp with measurements and math. When she saw him in the mess tent, a line of soldiers waiting for coffee, a newspaper folded like a weapon, she took his hand without ceremony and steered him away from the cluster of reporters who were practicing the soft circling of predators. "You look like a man who has realized he'd rather be plowing than parading," she said. And there was no mockery in it, only a kind of urgent kindness that named what had always been true. Audie let out a breath that could have been a laugh but wasn't. "If plowing kept boys alive, I'd never leave the field," he said. He wanted to tell her that bravery wasn't something to be declared by a loud man in shiny boots. It was an accounting of small mercies, of dragging a friend behind a hedge and sharing the last drop of water. It didn't make good copy. They moved through the hospital together. Claire introduced him to nurses who had stitched stomachs and sewn together more than uniforms. She watched him in the way a surgeon watches a pulse. He watched her work, how she kept the tremor from her hands, how she folded a darkening bandage with the precise tenderness of someone who had learned to make space for both pain and hope. The patients' faces were maps of the war. Jagged, soot-smudged, young men trying to remember jokes. Audie sat with them when he could, answering questions that asked for nothing heroic. What tobacco he liked, whether home smelled like rain. And in those small exchanges, he found something like restitution. But the press kept coming. Invitations to parades arrived in neat envelopes and telegrams. A colonel mouthed words to Audie about morale and speeches to rouse the boys. Patton's office sent a staffer with an itinerary that read like a national program: hospitals, re-enlistment centers, war bond rallies. Each entry had beside it the ghost of an image: Audie, standing upright, metal flashing, words of inspiration to be printed and carried home. When the staffer left, he did so with the air of a man who had delivered both blessing and leash. "It's not that I don't appreciate the intention," Audie told Claire that night under a lean shadow of stars, hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. I know what it does, what a face does when someone needs to believe, but it's not mine to give like that, not without something traded. Claire's answer was a long pause. Then, everyone wants a hero. Our problem is the world mistakes display for sacrifice. Her voice was threaded with fatigue and a resoluteness he recognized from the months she had spent negotiating for bandages and gasoline with officers who treated women's labor like optional equipment. If they parade you, they will parade us all. They'll use your name to smooth over shortages in hospitals and call it patriotism. They'll take your grief and put it on a poster. He pictured Patton's grin, the way the general had made Audie into a plane that might carry other people's hopes. The possibility that Patton's patronage would secure Claire's supplies pulsed in him like a splinter, a small, immediate remedy that could infect everything else. I could ask him, Audie said. I could go where they want me and ask for. He stopped because the list of needs was longer than any breath. I could try to make them see. Or you could let them see what they want and then discover they don't care when it matters, Claire said. Her hand found his forearm, grounding him. Don't let honor be the excuse they use to avoid accountability. Audie wrestled with the offer like a dog with a bone. The ledger in his head insisted that every right turn cost something: a friend, a feast, sleep. To accept Patton's designation would mean that he wore a shield that the brass might wield, and shields can become cages. To refuse meant watching the supply trucks miss a turn and thinking of men dying of infection because someone farther from the mud worried about optics. Beyond the immediate calculus of supplies lay something simpler and more intimate: the fact that every public appearance would drag Claire toward a light that burned too bright. She had made a life around the small darknesses, tending wounds, speaking softly to the men who were convulsed in nightmares, but a parade of flags and cheering men could uproot the delicate work of healing. The idea of photographers leaning into her ward, of patients being brought on display, made Audie's stomach run cold. On the third day, the colonel insisted Audie meet with a public affairs officer, a man with a practiced sympathy and a folder full of talking points. The officer's coffee smelled of civility and pencil shavings. The colonel thinks you could do wonders if you toured a few armories and bond drives, he said. It's a chance to honor your comrades and inspire men to follow. Audie looked at his hands as though they belonged to someone else. There were black marks under his nails from the trenches, a faded scar on his thumb where a shell had kissed him and left a souvenir. "What do I say?" he asked, and the simplicity of the question made the officer smile like a salesman. "You say what you feel," he said. "You tell them what courage looks like. They'll handle the rest." Audie left the tent with a hollow that did not want to be named, the perilous knowledge that words can be both armor and ammunition. When he found Claire later, sitting by an improvised stove with a cup clutched between both hands, he collapsed beside her and let the heat wash over him. "If I say no," he murmured, "they'll be disappointed. If I say yes, they'll own me." Claire looked at him, and for a heartbeat, the map of her own losses flashed across her face: her brother's empty chair, towns that would never be whole. "You must answer as Audie Murphy, not as a man in a uniform with a general's favor," she said. "Not because it's noble, but because it's true. No one else can decide what your silence or your speech will be worth." The answer did not arrive neat or righteous. It seeped in fragments. He helped Claire stitch a man's torn cheek. He sat up all night listening to a soldier's confession and caught himself at the edge of offering platitudes. He dreamed once more of crosses, but this time, between them, stood, briefly, the shape of a life that could be claimed in pieces: a half-hour of refusing a camera, an afternoon of quietly requisitioning bandages under a borrowed name, a brief note to a congressman, smuggled by a woman with a thermos and a stubborn jaw. Each small act felt like a stitch in a garment he might someday wear whole. When the telegram came from Patton's headquarters requesting a meeting, it arrived like a summons and a test both. Audie read it with Claire at his elbow, the paper a thin, insistent thing. "General would like to see you tomorrow at 11. Come prepared to discuss morale initiatives." The words carried the weight of command and of possibility. Audie folded the paper with hands that did not tremble for show, but because the ledger inside him quivered at the chance to protect the people he loved. He slept badly that night, not because of the meeting, but because the next morning would be the moment he had to choose whether to be a man in a story or the author of his own life. He opened the door to Patton's office and felt the room tighten like a noose. The general sat behind a desk of polished wood and maps, his uniform a constellation of ribbons. His gaze cut to Audie as if measuring grain. Patton's smile was not warm. It was appraisal. "Murphy," he said, clapping a hand on the chair opposite, "I've read what men like you do. Now I want you to tell the country." Audie felt the ledger in his ribs. He thought of Cole's laugh, of the boy with a missing tooth who'd called him sir in a way that made a man feel larger than he was allowed to be. He thought of Claire's hands, the worn plane of her palms, the small ration that had become a prayer. "I don't want to be a symbol, sir," he said. "I want—" the words fogged. "I want people to get what they need." Patton steepled his fingers. "Symbols carry provisions, son. They keep men from thinking of their own doubts. They make mothers write checks. They keep the home front steady. You step on a stage and soldiers march truer." His tone softened, an intentional danger. "You're an instrument. Play." Claire's face hovered behind his eyes, not present, but present enough to hold him still. He tried to fold the offer inward like a paper that could be creased and hidden. Patton's next words fell like a drop of varnish over a wound. "There are men, Private, who have started to whisper that hero-making is a necessary art. Heroes don't ask. They appear. They are useful." Audie left the office with a dossier full of itineraries and a head full of noise. The public affairs officer had smiled too much, promising that a tour would be carefully staged and beneficial to the cause. The colonel's instructions read like a map of good intentions: photograph opportunities, controlled exposure, brief remarks. The promises were comfortable until Audie considered the cost. What Claire's wards might become once lights and dates were set and the press arrived. The fracture began like a hairline crack. A reporter on the first day of the tour asked Audie whether courage could be taught. He answered the safe thing, something like, "You don't teach a man to live, you teach him to hope." The line made nice copy. The reporter filed it. The next day, a telegram arrived to Claire. "Audie Murphy will be making a morale visit to hospitals in the sector. Cameras present." Her answer came swift and sharp. "No cameras in our ward," she wrote back, hands steady but eyes burning. Patton's staff bristled. "You can't limit coverage," said a captain. "Public morale depends upon visibility." Audie watched as language sharpened into orders. He felt his voice become something others could file: helpful, heroic, editable. He tried to negotiate on Claire's behalf, quiet requisitions, off-record pledges, but found himself blocked by lanes of protocol he hadn't known existed. Men with ranks and pens told him to trust them. Audie remembered men who'd said, "Trust me," before bullets did a clean accounting of promises. The real fracture struck when Claire intercepted 2 photographers and told them bluntly to leave the ward. One of them pushed back with the arrogance of a man who believed his lens was a civic duty. "People need to see sacrifice," he said. Claire answered with a line that cut. "People need to stop making sacrifice into spectacle." The man reported back. Headlines loved conflict. Within 48 hours, the story became not only Audie, but Audie versus the nurse who resisted exposure. Hero denied camera by stern nurse, one wire read. Audie felt something like acid in his mouth. The press painted him as testy, as temperamental, as a man refusing his duty to morale. Soldiers he had sat with went silent around him, unsure whether to honor the image or the man. Patton sent a curt note, "Duty first." The general's shorthand was an elbow to the ribs. Audie resented what the word duty had come to mean, obedience to a script. Secrets leaked then, small, cruel things. A telegram surfaced, released by some eager soul in public affairs, listing the names of men Audie had recommended for commendation. One name, a kid he'd buried under a moonless sky, appeared still alive and decorated. Audie realized someone had polished his past for shine and left the real pieces in the mud. He confronted the public affairs officer, anger tasting of betrayal. "You took my ledger and edited it," he said. "You put gloss on graves." "History needs clarity, Private," the officer replied, voice efficient as a scalpel. "You do not have the platform to fix every imperfection." Claire's fracture with the outside world yawned wider when a supply clerk, pressured by the same public image machine, redirected a truck of bandages to a propaganda rally. Nurses improvised with gauze scrounged from theater curtains. Men bled longer because someone decided the optics of a sanitized hospital were worth more than dirty hands. Claire's fury was quiet and deep, the kind that rearranges bones. She accused Audie, quietly, of betrayal for even considering Patton's offer. He couldn't blame her. He'd nearly bartered their work for a banner. That night, a convoy came under fire outside a village where Claire had opened a new ward. Audie was there when the smoke settled, kneeling in mud and blood, his hands untidily certain. A shell had punched through a supply truck. The bandages they'd expected were gone. Men yelled. Claire moved through them like a seamstress mending flayed cloth, her face a strip of concentration so fierce it erased fatigue. Audie held a dying soldier's hand and felt something irrevocable in the looseness of someone else's goodbye. That public applause could not fill the spaces left by a missed bandage, that glory could not stitch a man. In the aftermath, Audie realized that the campaign for his image had already chosen sides. Some of the brass wanted a mascot, others wanted the practical benefits that mascot could buy. Audie saw the machinery of war, maps, trains, speeches, grind into decisions that cost lives in small increments. He understood then that his refusal could hurt Claire's work, but his compliance could hollow them both out. There was no tidy solution, only trade-offs and raw choices. The fracture widened into a chasm that ran through the center of him and through the fragile intimacy he had built with Claire. He had to choose which pieces of himself to hand over and which to keep. Audie woke to the scream of distant engines and the smell of cordite. Claire was already awake, packing bandages into a canvas satchel with hands that did not tremble. The convoy that had been rerouted to a rally had been ambushed on a narrow road. The missing supplies lay in a smoking ditch, and a village needed help now. Patton's itinerary hampered him no longer. There was no press out here, only iron and urgency. Audie grabbed a rifle and a list of names and moved as if the ledger in his head had become a map. They pushed through shattered hedgerows and a sky the color of bruises, and Claire directed men with the authority of someone who had learned rank from necessity. A burst of rifle fire knocked a stretcher askew. Audie dove and rolled, catching a fallen nurse and pulling her behind the shattered door of an overturned truck. He tasted blood and mud and the old arithmetic of survival. In the ruin of the supply truck, they found a crate of bandages half protected under a tarp. A mortaring began, and men cried out as shells painted the air. Audie organized a ragged line, handing bandages, barking orders, kneeling beside wounded with the careful, precise touch had seen Claire use. A grenade scream came so close he smelled its wires. He threw himself over a wounded corporal, taking the blast against his chest. feeling ribs fragment like scored wood. Pain folded him but did not close his eyes. Claire's hands were at his face, desperate and steady, and he felt her lips ghost his forehead. In the long bleeding minutes before aid, he thought of Patton's toast and said, like a benediction, "Not for banners, so they live." He survived the blast. His body changed. He walked away from the wreckage not as a symbol handed down from polished boots, but as a man who had chosen what courage meant: to take a blow so another could breathe. Patton would have to answer to that choice. After the explosion and the choosing, silence became work. Audie learned how to stitch a life back with the same hands that had once gripped a rifle. Claire taught him how to file requisitions and how to accept a compliment without shrinking. They lived temporarily between bandages and paperwork, between nights of whispered confessions and mornings cataloging supplies that might save a man's life. When the press returned, hungry for drama, Audie met them with an unglamorous truth. He would travel only where he could secure needed bandages and fuel, never to be posed for a poster again. Reporters left disgruntled, brass recalibrated. Patton came once, unannounced, and stood in the ward watching Claire work without comment. Later he took Audie aside and said, quieter than any toast, "You showed me what cost is." Audie took the hand extended and refused the tour that would turn wounds into decoration. He asked instead for trucks. They rebuilt a fragile trust with small victories, rerouted convoys, quietly requisitioned supplies, turned corners where compassion met bureaucracy. Claire argued with colonels and clerks. Audie stood where his name unsettled paperwork and made men move. Some nights they drank coffee and counted the boxes saved like spoils. Some mornings they found men who still needed more. The ledger never left Audie's pillow, names folded into a private geography. And he taught Claire each entry as if it were a map to rescue. The war continued, relentless and indifferent, but inside the patchwork of tents, they built something that outlasted headlines: a practice of care. They married in a small chapel between operations, only a few present, mostly convalescents who yelled blessings between jokes. No photographers came. Years later, veterans came back, bringing stories and silence. Audie taught steady hands and taught listening. Claire taught suturing and how to refuse spectacle without anger. Children learned to tie bandages and to call an old soldier by his name instead of a title. Patton's later parades softened into anecdotes told over coffee. Men remembered the toast, but now with a complexity that embarrassed them into humility. Audie kept the ledger, but added pages: births, small recoveries, letters that thanked them for saving more than bodies. In the evenings, they walked fields that smelled of damp earth and clover, and sometimes Audie spoke names aloud until the letters shone. Claire would stand with him and say nothing, merely squeeze his hand.